This incredible feat of architecture is not the most revolutionary thing about this place.
Very difficult to know what the purpose of something like Göbekli Tepe could be.
For decades, archaeologists stared at the ancient stones of Göbekli Tepe, baffled by the strange carvings etched into its 12,000-year-old pillars. Every theory failed, every explanation fell apart.
Visited the site and began digging. They realized what was really at this site.
What he discovered was mind-blowing. After discovering the first T-shaped pillar buried at the site, he soon found more of these massive structures.
Then, artificial intelligence examined them, reading every groove, every forgotten mark, and uncovered something no human mind had ever grasped. What it found wasn't just a piece of history, it was a warning from the very dawn of civilization. Inside the ancient world of Göbekli Tepe. In the dry southeast of Turkey, a low limestone hill rises above the wide Harran Plain. Locals call it Potbelly Hill. Archaeologists call it Göbekli Tepe. It stands only a few miles from the city of Şanlıurfa, resting on the Germuş Range, where the pale stone under your feet is the same rock ancient builders once carved with their own hands. What makes this ridge extraordinary is not how big it is, but how old. Göbekli Tepe dates to the very beginning of the Neolithic Age, roughly between 9,600 and 8,200 years BCE. This was long before pottery, long before metal. Yet on this exposed ridge, people were already cutting and shaping blocks of stone taller than a house and setting them upright in circles that still hold their shape today. Under the modern protective roofs, round and oval rooms appear in the limestone. Each one holds a pair of tall T-shaped pillars in the center, surrounded by a ring of shorter pillars built into thick circular walls. The central pair is enormous. Some stand around 18 feet high and weigh close to 20,000 pounds. The outer pillars reach roughly 13 feet. Think of the effort that took. No cranes, no iron chisels, no wheels. Just people with stone tools, ropes, and teamwork, lifting blocks of limestone into place with nothing but human power. The stone came from right here. The ridge itself served as a quarry. You can still see the trenches where the rock was cut and the shapes of unfinished pillars carved into the bedrock. Some look as if the workers had stepped away only yesterday, their outlines crisp, the chisel marks still sharp. From those scars, you can follow the full chain of work, from roughing out the pillar to hauling it up the slope and fitting it into a prepared socket. Despite decades of research, only a small part of the hill has been opened. Ground-scanning surveys show many more circles still buried under the soil. Archaeologists estimate that only about 1/10 of the entire site has been excavated so far, and the radar maps hint at least 20 large enclosures beneath the surface. The 4 that we can actually see are labeled A through D. The carvings on those stones are striking. Animals seem to move across the surfaces. Foxes with long bodies, wild boars with short legs and heavy heads, snakes curling around edges, vultures stretching their wings. Human figures are rare, but the pillars themselves are shaped to stand in for people. Some have arms and hands carved along their sides, with belts and loincloths wrapped around their bases. The broad T-tops act like heads. What might be most surprising is not how it was built, but how it was buried. These massive rooms were not left to crumble. People filled them in deliberately. They poured tons of limestone rubble and debris into the enclosures until the walls and pillars disappeared. Enclosure D alone was packed with an estimated 500 cubic yards of fill, enough to cover a small modern house. That fill tells its own story. Mixed among the limestone chunks are everyday traces of life. Flint flakes from tool making, broken bones from meals, and even fragments of human bone with cut marks. These details show what kind of activity surrounded the site. Stoneworking, butchering, feasting, and cleaning up after gatherings large enough to leave mountains of waste. Farther out on the slopes, smaller buildings mark later phases of occupation. The same ridge shows evidence of food processing on a large scale. Archaeologists cataloged more than 7,000 grinding tools.
Inevitably in archaeology, if we don't know what something is for, we think of ritual. But really, it's pure speculation.
Slabs, handstones, and shallow basins, all showing wear from crushing and milling grains. Microscopic traces of plant silica confirm the work. Wild barley, einkorn, and other early cereals were being ground here long before formal agriculture took hold. That much equipment points to mass food preparation, likely for large seasonal gatherings when people came together to carve, build, and celebrate. The location might look harsh now, but the builders understood how to make it livable. Channels cut into the bedrock lead to deep pits that likely served as cisterns. Together, they could hold roughly 5,300 cubic feet of water. enough to keep a community supplied through dry months. That's what allowed people to stay and work on this high ridge for so long. When researchers looked beyond Göbekli Tepe itself, they found it was part of something larger. All across Şanlıurfa province are hills filled with similar traces. Other stone sanctuaries and settlements, now grouped under the name Taş Tepeler, which means stone hills. Sites like Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe share the same T-shaped pillars and animal carvings, but each has its own design. At Karahan Tepe, excavators uncovered a T-pillar carved with a human face, a blank, mask-like stare emerging from stone that had been buried for more than 10,000 years. Together, these sites show that this whole region was a network of builders experimenting with architecture and imagery at the dawn of settled life. Göbekli Tepe's story spans many centuries. While the earliest and largest circular enclosures belong to the very first stage of the Neolithic period, later generations built smaller rectangular rooms around them, often reusing stones from the older rings. Radiocarbon samples taken from charcoal and plaster confirm this sequence clearly. First came the great stone circles, then the smaller domestic spaces that surrounded them, and finally the careful burial of it all beneath a thick layer of rubble and earth. The path to rediscovering Göbekli Tepe began in the early 1990s. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying the area when he realized that what locals thought were simple stone fences were actually the tops of buried pillars. He began excavations with the German Archaeological Institute and the Şanlıurfa Museum, revealing the first of the Great Circles. After his death in 2014, teams from Istanbul University and the German Institute continued the work. In 2018, UNESCO added Göbekli Tepe to its World Heritage List, describing it as a place of outstanding universal value, a turning point where small bands of hunter-gatherers took their first leap toward organized, large-scale building and community life. You can see that organization in the layout of every circle. The builders shaped each room with precision. Solid walls, built-in benches, central pairs of pillars facing one another like two figures in silent conversation. Some floors were covered in a smooth lime plaster that still shows burn marks from when it was laid and hardened. Later, when a room was cleaned or repaired, the same lime floors were resurfaced. Every groove and line has been recorded in extraordinary detail. Archaeologists now use high-resolution photography, laser scanning, and three-dimensional modeling to capture every mark before it fades. These digital records allow them to study how each pillar was shaped and how it has weathered over thousands of years. The environment around the ridge also helps explain why people chose it. The view stretches across the Harran Plain, giving sight in every direction. Flint for tools lies scattered across the surface, and the limestone is soft enough to carve yet strong enough to stand. Wild pistachio and almond trees grew nearby, and seasonal herds of gazelle and onager would have passed within reach. This was a place rich enough to gather people, but quiet enough to feel apart from everyday life. The builders left their message carved into stone, and when AI finally read those marks, it saw patterns no human ever could. Inside the feasts and rituals of Göbekli Tepe. If you had walked into the Göbekli Tepe when it was alive with people, the first thing to hit you wouldn't have been the carvings. It would have been the smell. The air would be thick with roasted meat and crushed grain, the scent of a feast large enough to feed hundreds. When archaeologists dug through the fill that later buried the site, they found the proof in bone by the ton.
Finish this T-pillar, but I do think that this is a case of the simplest explanation being the most likely. Just look at how big this thing is.
Aurochs, gazelles, wild donkeys, deer, all butchered, cooked, and eaten in numbers that only make sense if whole crowds gathered here. One bone even froze a story in place, the upper foreleg of an aurochs, with a flint point still lodged inside it. Whoever threw that spear aimed for the ribs and missed, and the people who came knew when to come. Gazelle teeth tell the story. As a gazelle grows, its teeth record the seasons in their chemical layers. When scientists tested those teeth from Göbekli Tepe, the pattern showed animals hunted mainly in late summer and fall, the season when herds crowded the plains below. It means the gatherings here were seasonal, timed to the rhythms of migration and abundance. Food, though, was only half the reason they gathered. Among the animal bones were fragments of human skulls, hundreds of them, and a few carried marks that could never be accidental. Deep, deliberate grooves had been cut into the bone, sometimes along the top, sometimes across the forehead. A few had small holes drilled clean through. Microscopic studies showed the cuts were made while the bone was still fresh. In some cases, traces of red pigment were found in the grooves. The message is clear. These weren't burials. They were trophies, relics, or symbols used in rituals. Archaeologists call it a form of skull cult, a tradition where certain heads were cleaned, carved, painted, and possibly displayed long after death. Out of more than 700 human fragments, only a handful show this treatment, suggesting these weren't random victims. They were chosen. The animals were part of the ritual life too. The mix of bird bones found at Göbekli Tepe is unusual for this region and time. Here, small birds appear far more often than large ones, while nearby sites from the same era show the opposite. That difference probably isn't just about hunting choices. It might point to a special meaning attached to certain species, or to gatherings that happened in a different season when smaller birds were more common. Color once filled the spaces that now look bare.
Narratives surrounding the site, if you will, and it really is a truly spectacular site.
For years, the pillars appeared as plain stone, bleached by the sun. But as teams cleaned new finds under shelter, paint began to appear. In 2023, a carved wild boar statue emerged, still carrying red, white, and black pigment. Even the stone hints at connections that reached far beyond the hill. Mixed in with the local flint tools are tiny shards of obsidian, volcanic glass that doesn't exist anywhere near Göbekli Tepe. Tests trace them to volcanoes over 100 miles to the east, around Bingöl and Nemrut Dağ. Each fragment means someone traveled or traded, carrying pieces of the distant world to this ridge. The rituals on the ground were one thing, but the meaning carved into stone pointed higher, to the sky itself. The sky story, hidden in Göbekli Tepe's carvings. When you look up at the night sky, it feels timeless, but it isn't. Over thousands of years, the sky slowly changes. Earth wobbles as it spins, like a slow spinning top that leans one way, then the other. Astronomers call that wobble precession, and it's a quiet, predictable motion that takes about 26,000 years to complete a full circle. It's not something you'd ever notice in one lifetime, but over long stretches of time it gently shifts which constellations line up with the sun during the seasons. That slow drift matters because some researchers believe Pillar 43 itself might record what the sky looked like at a specific moment in the distant past. They point to the animals carved across its surface, especially the scorpion, and say they resemble constellations. If that panel is read as a kind of star map, then by rolling the sky backward through precession, the pattern seems to align with one narrow window in deep time. A study published in 2017 made that case directly, suggesting that the carving matches constellations as they appeared in the 11th millennium BCE. But the archaeologists who actually dig there are careful about these kinds of claims. They remind everyone that the site changed over centuries. Pillars were reused, moved, or recarved. Buildings were rebuilt and then deliberately buried. So it's risky to treat one stone as a literal snapshot of the heavens. Even without looking at the carvings, that time window, around 12,000 to 11,000 years ago, links directly to one of the most dramatic climate moments in Earth's recent history. Back then, the world was warming up from the last ice age. But just as the glaciers were retreating, something strange happened. The warming stopped. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged again, almost overnight on a geological clock. This sudden chill lasted about 1,000 years and is known as the Younger Dryas. You can see the Younger Dryas clearly in ice cores, lake sediments, and pollen records all across the world. It's a clean, sharp signal. What no one can fully agree on is why it happened. One group of scientists blames changes in ocean currents, a kind of chain reaction triggered when massive amounts of glacial meltwater flooded into the North Atlantic and disrupted the flow of warm water from the tropics. But another group believes something else struck Earth from above. Not a single massive impact like the one that killed the dinosaurs, but a cluster of smaller airbursts or fragments from space that scattered dust, started wildfires, and sent the climate reeling. That's called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it's one of the most controversial debates in modern geology. The reason it won't die quietly is because some evidence does seem to point upward. In 2013, scientists studying Greenland's ice found a sudden spike in platinum, an element that often traces back to space dust or meteor debris, right at the start of the Younger Dryas. A few years later, another team reported finding the same platinum spike in soil layers across North America, all dated to that same window in time. When different sites show the same chemical fingerprint at the same layer, it starts to look like a global event. Other groups added new pieces to the puzzle. Tiny glassy beads called microspherules, which form only in extreme heat. Layers rich in soot, hinting at continent-wide fires, and strange metallic particles buried in lake mud. Each of these clues pointed to something violent happening in the atmosphere. And then, in 2024, a fresh study took that search offshore. In Baffin Bay, between Canada and Greenland, researchers found a layer in ocean core samples that carried the same mix: metallic grains, microspherules, and another strong platinum spike, all sitting right at the boundary where the Younger Dryas began. It's the first time that impact-style signature has been reported from deep-sea cores instead of land sites, and that's why the debate flared up again. Still, this story has two sides. For every study suggesting an impact, there's another arguing that the evidence doesn't fit. Some geologists say the particles could come from volcanic activity, or even from massive wildfires that don't need anything from space to start. Others note that the dating between sites doesn't always line up perfectly, and that the distinctive crater you'd expect from a major strike hasn't been confirmed anywhere. So, the impact theory remains on the table, but not settled. One possible space culprit keeps coming up in both the science and the folklore: the torrid meteor stream. Every year, Earth passes through this trail of debris twice, once in late spring and again in late fall. The fragments come from a family of shattered comets that includes Comet Encke. Most years, the torrids produce only slow, bright fireballs that drift across the night sky. But sometimes, the stream thickens. In 2015, camera networks across Europe recorded a surge of unusually large fireballs, bright enough to light up whole valleys. Astronomers analyzing the footage found that Earth had passed through a dense branch of the torrid stream, a swarm of larger fragments hidden inside the wider trail.
Ahura Mazda told the great early king Yima that there would be a terrible disaster. A giant serpent would descend from the heavens to the earth.
It's not proof of an ancient disaster, but it shows the torrids are more complicated than anyone thought. When Earth meets one of these thick knots, the odds of large meteor strikes rise sharply. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.